You hear the occasional shouts and clang of metal from combat, the crash of ships ramming against ships. That's right, you're in the middle of an ancient sea battle, a rower aboard a trireme. Hello, this is Harold Halfdan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it'd be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we're back on the Archaeo SMP, and if you recall, I talked about the fact that I'm building my base this season all around this central lake, so I can start incorporating some ships into my base. So that's exactly what we'll be doing today. We're going to build 3 different ships from the ancient Mediterranean, from 3 different empires. First, we're going to build an ancient Greek Athenian Trireme, and then we're going to build a Carthaginian Quadrireme, and then finishing out the trio of ships will be a Roman Trireme. I'm going to divide this episode into a couple of different parts, building each ship from each culture, and while doing so, we'll be talking a bit about that culture's history and their naval traditions and that kind of stuff. And then, once all 3 ships are complete, I'm going to go back and talk about those ships themselves. Before I jump right into that, however, I want to touch briefly on what a trireme and a quadrireme are. Simply put, the name of these ships refers to how many lines of rowers or groups of rowers on each side. So for example, a bireme would have 2 lines of rowers on each side, bi meaning 2, and then a trireme, tri meaning 3, like a triangle, means that there are 3 lines of rowers on each side. So a quadrireme thus has 4 sets of rowers on each side, and they didn't just stop there. Certainly in later days, there would be quinquiremes, or ships with 5 sets of rowers, all the way up to the largest of these kind of ships built by Ptolemy IV of Egypt, who reputedly built a ship with 40 sets of rowers. It's estimated that that ship would have 4,000 oarsmen and 2,850 marines. For a trireme, however, that number of the crew was around 200, with about 170 of that crew being oarsmen. Okay, let's jump into it and start building our first ship. In 480 BC, the Greek world was in peril. The Persian king Xerxes had marshaled his forces and marched his army to conquer Greece. His goal was to put the Greeks, specifically the Athenians, in their place for having supported the rebelling Ionian Greek city-states. Ionian Greeks were the Greeks that lived on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. In 499 to 494 BC, they rebelled against his predecessor, the Persian king Darius. In that engagement, the Ionian Greeks had reached out to the other Greek city-states asking for help, and the Athenians voted to send a small expedition to observe and aid their Greek brethren. In the ensuing conflict, the city of Sardis in 498 BC had been burned to the ground. Darius was clearly not happy and reputedly instructed one of his attendants to continuously remind him that Athens needed to be punished and destroyed. Darius died in 486 BC, but his successor, Xerxes, put his plans into motion and had crossed over from Asia and marched south into Greece, being waylaid at Thermopylae. Yes, that Thermopylae, made famous by the last stand of the 300 Spartan warriors who held the pass and fought to their death there. What's less well known from the general modern public, who maybe have only heard the story from the movie 300, is that while the Spartans took point on the land, it was the Athenians who took point on the sea with their navy. And while the Spartans and the other Greeks were defeated on land, and the Persians poured south into Greece and got their retribution by burning down Athens, the combined Greek navy, led by the Athenians, got the upper hand over the Persian-controlled navy and defeated them at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. It was this naval defeat that helped coax the Persians to leave Greece, and for Xerxes, who had personally gone with the invading army, to go back to his capital. In fact, it was their dominance at sea and naval power that allowed Athens to create and hold their empire. This navy was key to Athenian life across all classes of people, and many of the rulers and leaders of Athens served as admirals, and many of the common citizens served as rowers. Yeah, you heard that right. While there's a general misconception that the rowers of these naval ships were enslaved people shackled to their oars and being whipped to row ever faster, that simply wasn't the case in the ancient world. Instead, rowers had to be citizens. They were highly trained individuals, and they were paid positions. I could go into a ton more detail about the Athenian navy and their stories of the history and the various victories and defeats at sea, both in their famous conflict with Sparta and the Peloponnesian War and other conflicts, but we still still have 2 more empires to talk about and 2 more ships to build, so I'll tease it there. But if you want to learn more, I recommend you go check out a book called The Lords of the Sea by J.R. Hale, which deep dives into the Athenian naval traditions and their history. The next ship I'm going to build and the empire I'm going to talk about is the Carthaginians, or as the Romans would call them, the Punic people, or in other words, the Phoenicians. Carthage started as a colony of the Phoenician city-state of Tyre, and Tyre is located along the coast of modern-day Lebanon. Carthage was founded in 814 BC. The Phoenicians were primarily a trade-based culture and were known for their exceptional seafaring abilities. They fanned out across the Mediterranean, building small trading outposts and forming a substantial trade network, with the city of Carthage in North Africa, in the modern-day country of Tunisia, being one of those original trading posts. The Phoenicians allowed for a good deal of autonomy in their colonies, and Carthage grew stronger and stronger and more prosperous over time and started establishing its own trading relationships, including establishing and incorporating areas under their sway throughout northern Africa. This influence would extend to other places over time, like Sicily, which was a substantial source of grain, as well as into Spain, where rich deposits of silver could be found. At that time, Sicily was split between Carthaginian control in the west and the Greek city-state of Syracuse in the southeast. In Sicily, Carthage and Syracuse were in conflict, and there had been about 200 years of an off-again, on-again conflict starting around 480 BC between Carthage and Syracuse as they vied for territory on Sicily and trading rights throughout the wider area. In 289 BC, a group of Italian mercenaries who had been hired previously by Syracuse, called the Mamertines, rebelled against Syracuse and occupied what's now the modern-day city of Messina, in the northeast of the island of Sicily. Those mercenaries appealed to both Carthage and Rome for assistance against Syracuse. Carthage accepted the terms and put a garrison in place in Messina. Rome previously hadn't been involved in Sicily at all, but decided to become involved because it was interested in expanding further southward after having recently consolidated its power in the south of the Italian peninsula over the other Greek city-states that had been located there. As such, Rome, despite Carthage having placed a garrison in Messina, sent one of their own to protect Messina. The Mamertines, that Italian mercenary group, expelled the Carthaginian garrison, and the Roman garrison moved in. That small conflict ended up ballooning into what would become a 23-year war between Rome and Carthage, which lasted from 264 to 241 BC, and would become known to history as the First Punic War. This would become the first of 3 wars fought between those two great powers, Rome and Carthage. The first war mostly took place on the island of Sicily and featured many great sea battles in and around Sicily. The Second Punic War was the one that featured the famous Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca and his elephants that he took over the Alps to invade Italy. And then the Third Punic War ultimately ended in the complete and utter destruction of the city of Carthage. The Carthaginians would end up losing all 3 of the wars to the Romans, and with the conclusion of each war seeing more and more land and territory ceded to the Romans, as well as having to pay a lot of reparations. Okay, so we've talked about the Athenian Greek naval traditions and the Phoenician Carthaginian naval traditions, but what about the Roman naval traditions? Well, they didn't really have any. Rome was predominantly an army-based military and never really focused at all on the navy. That might seem surprising given that Rome is located not far from the coast in the middle of a huge peninsula in the middle of a giant sea, but it really wasn't anything that it spent much time concentrating on. That's actually one of the reasons why I find the time period of the First Punic War and that conflict so fascinating. In that conflict, you have 2 major powers of their time, Rome, who focused on land combat, and Carthage, who focused on sea power. At that time in the conflict, Carthage ruled the waves, and Rome had no real chance of defeating them at sea. In fact, according to legend, Rome based its naval ship design off a Carthaginian ship that had either run aground or sank in shallow waters, allowing the Romans to salvage the ship and then reverse engineer what was needed to construct it. If the Romans were good at one thing, it was their engineering prowess. And so with that design in hand, they set about creating a whole fleet of ships off that design. Unfortunately, it takes more than a ship design and lots of ships to win naval battles. The Romans kept seeing defeat after defeat, and they were still rubbish at sailing. And so what do people do when they can't win at something? Well, they change the rules of the game. And so what they did is they found a way to alter naval battles to act more like battles on land. In other words, something that they were good at. Their innovation that allowed them to do this was to put something at the front of the ship called a corvus, in other words, a specialized boarding device. This boarding platform had a spike at the front of it, and the whole boarding platform could be dropped down onto the deck of an enemy's trireme or other ship, and that spike would then stick like a big nail into that ship and basically nailing the two ships together. Roman soldiers could then pour over the boarding platform and fight the enemy sailors in hand-to-hand combat. While hand-to-hand combat itself wasn't an innovation, that had occurred frequently throughout history, as ships had crashed next to one another and maybe someone had thrown a grappling hook over there and then tied the two ships together. It wasn't until the corvus was invented and utilized thusly by the Romans that naval combats were able to be turned into a bunch of effectively small land engagements. This allowed the Romans to turn the tide against the Carthaginians at sea, which ultimately helped them win the First Punic War. Incidentally, I wanted to point out while I'm talking about this Roman trireme that I based the color scheme of this, and then generally its design, off this mosaic I'm popping up on screen here now. And this mosaic was found in Tunisia. Okay, let's pop over this corvus and head over to the Greek Athenian trireme. Now, I just talked about the type of combat that involved fighting hand-to-hand, but naval combat in this era also took the form of two other types of combat strategies. The first of these other strategies was to use the ships as a floating platform where the enemy could be attacked with projectile weapons such as javelins or bows and arrows, attacking the ships around them that were within range. One of the innovations on the Athenian and Greek triremes over other triremes of this era, and this era I'm talking about is 480 BC, so a little earlier than the Roman or the Carthaginian ships I built here, and that's that Athenians fitted their triremes with these wooden rowing frames. This is something that the Carthaginian ship lacks. So if you look over across the way, you can see that I didn't include this top bit, which is the external rowing frame, also called an outrigger on that ship. This outrigger stuck out over the side of the ship and provided a platform over the top tier of rowers and oars. It also allowed a place to mount a side screen to protect the rowers from projectiles that were fired from other ships. Similarly, the top of the frame could then hold a protective covering that could be made of wood or canvas. The Olympus is a modern-built replica of a Greek trireme that was built to test out and do experimental archaeology over how triremes functioned and test their limits in a practical sense. You can see on the Olympus how the rowing frame looked, as well as how the top decking of wood looks over the top of that trireme. In a Greek trireme, the top tier of rowers were the most prestigious, followed by the middle tier, with the least prestigious position for rowers being on the bottom tier, effectively in the hold of the ship, right above the waterline. So you can see in my Minecraft reproduction, these spruce trap doors here for the bottom tier of rowers sit right above the waterline. Okay, so I talked about hand-to-hand combat, and then I've also talked about fighting with projectiles. But the other way these naval combats took place is where one ship would ram into another ship. And so you can see with all three of these ships at the front of the ship, which is called a beak, there was fitted a bronze ram. These rams were made of bronze because unlike iron, bronze wouldn't rust. These were made using the lost wax method of casting, and if you want to learn more about how that was done, please go check out the video on my channel where I recreate the Colossus of Rhodes. I talk all about the lost wax casting process in that video. So what would happen for one ship to ram another is that the admiral overseeing the fleet would maneuver the ships into place so that the rowers could get up their speed and then crash the bronze ram from their ship into the flank of an enemy ship. Head-to-head or bronze ram to bronze ram attacks were avoided, though damage to rams such as a hit like that would cause have been found archaeologically. Also, a direct T-bone where an attacker would hit the enemy directly at the 90-degree mark was also avoided, as the ram of the attacker could become stuck and lodged in the enemy ship. thus not allowing them to pull out and continue with the battle. So it kind of disabled both ships by doing that. So that was avoided. So the best type of attack was an indirect flank hit, and that would allow the attacker to then disable the enemy ship and then cause potentially a big hole under this waterline in its hull, and then continue to engage other enemy ships. Okay, with the first two ships covered, let's talk about the Carthaginian ship. Unlike the first two, which were triremes, I recreated this Carthaginian ship as a quadrime, meaning there were 4 rowers on each side, not 3. From what I could determine in my research, where the 3 rowers of a trireme were set on 3 different tiers, with the quadrime, the 4 rowers were not on 4 distinct tiers, but rather in 2 tiers, so there were 2 rowers per oar. The other difference that my research pointed out is that quadrimes were a bit larger or longer, which made sense given that the crew numbers were higher and there were more rowers, and so the ship had to be longer to hold more of those oarsmen. And so in this recreation of this Carthaginian ship, I did make it a bit longer than I did the 2 triremes. The other design difference between this Carthaginian vessel and the 2 triremes is that I included the masts and the sails. In this era and type of naval vessel, masts and sails were a secondary mode of propulsion, the oars being the principal mode of propulsion. So if a trireme or a quadrime knew they were going to be going into combat, the masts and the sails would be removed and then left on shore or stowed away. So that's why I left them off the 2 triremes, which are locked in combat over there. But on this Carthaginian ship, I imagined maybe they were heading out to sea for a longer journey and not involved in the combat, so I left those sails in place. I also haven't up to this point really talked about these type of ships' construction, so let me touch on that briefly. The keel of the ship was the strong bit that ran from stem to stern and was mostly made of a strong oak. Planks were built out from the side, laying one plank on top of the other, not overlapping, like I talked about when I discussed Viking ships in a past episode from the last season of Archaeo SMP. The planks of these ships were made of pine and then held together with wooden pegs. In fact, the whole of a trireme or any of these other types of ships were held together with only wooden pegs and not nails or rivets, again, unlike the much later Viking era ships, which had nails in place. Cords of linens were woven between the planks to help with waterproofing and seal up any potential gaps in the wood. Linen has the property of being stronger when wet than while dry and doesn't stretch when wet, so it made a great material for use on naval vessels like that. After the planks were in place, the ribs of the ships were added, which would provide rigidity and structure, as well as a tensioned cord, which would run around the whole of the inside of the ship, again, helping provide rigidity and hold everything together. So basically it was like the tendons of the ship that would keep everything tight. The exterior of the hull of the ship was covered in pitch, or when they could get it, tar, to waterproof it, which would give the exterior of the ship where that was coated a blackish color. That's why I used dark oak for the bits of these ships' hulls that were under the water or at the waterline. The pitch also protected the ship from a type of mollusk called a shipworm that loved to burrow into the wood of ships, creating holes in the wood, which could weaken and cause the ships to become fragile over time. And in a ship that you're going to ram other ships with, fragility is not something you want in a structure. Well, that wraps up this episode. I hope you liked this trio of ancient naval ships. I put a bunch of links, as I always do, to articles that I've used in the episode, so please go check that out if you want to learn more about this topic. Make sure you take the time to like my videos and subscribe and all that kind of stuff if you like them and want to see more of them. Thanks. Have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.